Thank you, President, and I want to move this important motion number 370. It says that this House, 1, notes A, the decision of the government to impose a curfew commencing at 8 p.m. on Sunday the 2nd of August was not based on health advice. B, the Chief Health Officer, Professor Brett Sutton, has said, and I quote, "The curfew came in as part of the state of disaster. It wasn't a state of emergency requirement. I was consulted on it, but it was a separate decision-making pathway," unquote. C, that the Premier, the Honourable Daniel Andrews, has not explained where the advice to impose the curfew came from. And 2, requires, in accordance with the Standing Order 11.01, the Leader of the Government in the Legislative Council table in the Council by 2 p.m. Friday the 18th of September copies of the briefs and other materials upon which the decision to impose a curfew was based, and 3, calls on the Government to immediately lift the curfew due to the unjustified imposition on our liberties and freedoms. I'm a former Health Minister, and I am not averse to using the powers in the Public Health and Wellbeing Act judiciously and appropriately. We are in a crisis. I accept that fully, the COVID-19 crisis, and that is not just in Victoria, it's not just in Australia, it is an international crisis. But this curfew that has been imposed is actually very unusual internationally. It is more draconian than has been used in most other places of the world, and it has not been explained. We've heard, and I will go back over the evidence. I don't intend to extend my contribution beyond what is necessary to explain the genesis and direction of this motion and the reasons that people should vote for it. But I will first step through the developing surprise that Victorians faced as the curfew was brought into operation at that time in very early August. I think Victorians were quite shocked that this was what we were going to endure. None of us have lived through a curfew before. In the whole of the lives of the people of this state, there has not been a curfew of this type, even remotely of this type. It is a draconian step that has been taken without the proper balancing that is in the Public Health and Wellbeing Act. Now, Mr Limbrick has repeatedly referred, and correctly, and I understand this, having been very familiar with this Act at previous times, the proportionality that is required to balance things with the Public Health and Wellbeing Act and the orders that can be made by the Chief Health Officer or their delegate. Now, those balancing steps cannot have been taken in this case because the balancing steps were not taken, or the advice was not tendered by the Department of Health or the officers in the Department of Health. And I record here that I've actually spoken to people deep inside the Public Health Division, and this was not dreamed up by them. It was not dreamed up by them. It was not dreamed up by Professor Sutton, and we've heard that it was not dreamed up by the police either. I want to put on the record here today, President, some of the comments that have been made. Professor Sutton did not come up with the idea, but Chief Commissioner Shane Patton has told Neil Mitchell it's legally enforceable. These are endorsed by his deputy, so by default him. If he believes it is appropriate to be in place to restrict movement and to stop the spread of the virus, then he leaves it in. If he doesn't leave it in, says Mr Patton. So he's putting it all back on the Chief Health Officer, who flicks it in the other direction. At a different point in that conversation, the Chief Commissioner said, "I was never consulted." This is Chief Commissioner Shane Patton. "I was never consulted. I've made inquiries to determine if anyone within the organisation was briefed on the matter, and as best I can work out, our policy areas was provided with a copy of the proposed guidelines for our information a couple of hours before they were signed off." I mean, this is actually extraordinary stuff. Extraordinary stuff. Patton said, "It's not a decision I was involved in. That appears to be a decision, appears that in the Chief Health Officer directions. How it came to be there, I'm unaware. All I can say is that it's a document that is containing the directions from the Chief Health Officer." I was never consulted, he says further. This is important. I was never consulted. I've made inquiries. He goes on to make similar sorts of comments through the... Professor Sutton said, I was not consulted on it. I was consulted on it, but it was a separate decision-making pathway. That means it was not a pathway in deciding where to go inside the Department of Health. The public health officials who should have been looking at this, should have been balancing, should have been working out the proportionalities, were not involved in this process at all. Now, we know that more generally this COVID-19 crisis has been managed by the Premier alone in his office, sitting in a small bunker with a small number of people. And this is indicative of it. The two great silos that should have been working with him should have been working to refine and work out whether this was in fact the best way to go, and be prepared to put in the public domain that this was the best way to go, have been absent from this point. Daniel Andrews has said it was his call to implement the curfew, and he doesn't know who recommended it. He doesn't know who recommended it. The Premier says it's his call, but he doesn't know who recommended it. I can't necessarily pinpoint for you the exact individual and the exact moment it was suggested that we put a curfew on. Just put a curfew on. It's not the decision that was made easily. The curfew has racked in more than $6 million worth of fines. Daniel Andrews says he can't pinpoint it. The Leader of the Opposition has made points that this is a very tough measure and was not based on health advice, and he's correct. Term curfew is rather loaded, says Mr Andrews. Rather loaded. I actually think it's a very accurate description. A curfew is a curfew. It's not a loaded term at all. But at the end of the day, it is effective in reducing movement. We're not removing it because it works. Well, it certainly is effective in reducing movements. If you deploy the full resources of the constabulary to stop people moving around, it certainly will restrict movement. There's no question about the effectiveness in restricting movement. The question is whether movement restriction is actually the objective that's required here, or whether actually congestion might be a better target. And when there's some evidence that's there now that the curfew may in fact be counterproductive in some ways, in a strict health sense. Indeed, most of us who go to the supermarket know that if you go there at 7:30 or 7:15 at night, before the curfew is almost in place, there will be a heightened number of people in that supermarket. We know that people are clustering at petrol stations at the same time. Instead of people being spread out over a lengthy period, they are being clustered into a smaller period of time, actually congesting people, arguably, and according to some public health people, increasing the risk of transmission, not decreasing it. Part of the task is to keep distance between people and not have people congested in a large number in one place at one time, and such a place would be a Woolworths supermarket or a Coles supermarket or an Aldi supermarket at about 7:15. My supermarket closes at 7:30, so you've got to be in the checkout at that time, otherwise you don't get served. I was talking to one of the checkout people the other day at length, and I won't say the name, but that person made it very clear to me that this is a regular pattern. Every single night there is a flood of people come in between 6:30 and 7:30 to get their groceries, as you would predict, on the way home from work in the congested period of time. So we've actually got evidence, in fact, before our eyes, that the curfew may be less effective than it should be and may actually be, in some respects, counterproductive. But either way, this motion makes the point very clearly that this was not health advice. Subsequent to the motion being completed, there was obviously the information that it was not police advice either. The Premier said he doesn't know who it was that provided the advice. I say the people of the community are entitled to see the advice, to see the information, and hence there is a documents request in this motion to deliver to the chamber those documents. It can't be very many. It can't be a voluminous request. It can't be extreme because, we know that it's a very narrow band of people over in the Premier's office who have driven this advice. It's not at Health. It's not at police. Where has the information come from? And I can vouch the fact that some in the Public Health Division are angry that this was sort of initially hooked on them as this is health advice. Well, no, it's not. And some have said that that the instrument involved here is from the state of disaster. It's not. And the document tabled in the chamber today, report to the Parliament on the extension of the declaration of state of emergency by the Health Minister, makes it clear that curfew was part of that thing. On page 12, if people want to go and read it, the stay-at-home directions, restricted areas, number 15, modified the curfew provisions, and it goes on to discuss the 8 p.m. and so forth. It makes it very clear that these points, the stay-at-home directions, restricted areas, number 15, it makes it clear that this is about closing down. It's about the curfew. There's further detail, I should say, at page 55, but I make the point that at page 55 there's still not a lot of detail. The restricted area directions are listed in that section there for the 2nd of August and around. So people can read those, but they can also see from these documents that there's not a lot of detail. There's no explanation about how these measures have been weighted. There's no focus on the proportionality that you would expect in this kind of public health advice under the Public Health and Wellbeing Act 2008. There should be that proportionality. It should be weighed and that should be public. So hence this motion has the request for those briefs and supporting documents on which the Premier has relied and the relevant delegated official has signed into law through the Public Health and Wellbeing Act directions which put the curfew in place. So it's a tough set of steps that have been taken by government. Has it restricted movement? Well, yes, Acting President, it has, because putting the legal force in and putting a fining provision in, actually using the tough arm of the law, in this case to keep people home, is a very real impact. But is this the proportionate and best way to go? That is an entirely separate question. And I say that it's not. And I say that the Premier should bring forward the documents to prove otherwise if that is the case, if he believes there are documents that show this is the case. I can't necessarily pinpoint for you the exact individual and exact moment it was suggested we put a curfew on, he said. The Premier has admitted the curfew was all his idea. Basically, the Premier has admitted that. Well, the term curfew is rather loaded, he says. Well, I don't think Victorians think it's loaded. They think it's an actual description of what is actually happening. It's a curfew. You're chopped, you can't go, you've got to go home. So, yeah, it's a very simple point that I'm making here. Mr Wilson, my friend Tim Wilson, has written to the Equal Opportunity Commission. No doubt they'll have something to say on this. They were against the 12-month extension of the state of emergency, but they were strangely silent through much of the changes here. Daniel Andrews said in The Guardian, quoted in The Guardian, that is my answer to Mr Wilson, and what he chooses to do with his time is a matter for him. Police need rules they can enforce. Well, they had a lot of rules already. And if you doubt me, have a look at the document tabled today and you'll see pages after pages after pages. There's nearly 2,000 pages of rules and notes about the rules. But notably absent from that document is the analysis of why each of these is put in place in detail, and the balancing that's required under the Act. The proportionality is not there in the document that was tabled today. So that is why 2 weeks ago in this chamber we sought the documents relating to those many health orders, and we still don't have those. The state government could have provided those. They could have moved quickly on that, but they have chosen not to, and I think that that is stonewalling. But this document tabled today does elucidate a tiny bit, but doesn't provide the main questions, the main background information. The Guardian went on, the strategy only works if we limit movement, if we want police to be spending all their time having to move people on from Macca's car parks where there are pop-up social gatherings that are not lawful. I'm going to have police wasting their time. I'm going to have police wasting their time doing that. There are very few legal reasons to leave your home. The curfew doesn't change that. It simply means police have an easier job. Given the year that Victoria Police has had and the sterling work they're doing, and I would generally agree with that, we ought to do everything we can to make their job a little bit easier. But that doesn't mean that that's a balancing reason for imposing a harsh curfew on the community. And as the Premier himself admits, the rules are already there to stop people gathering in a Macca's car park. The police can actually do that work quite straightforwardly under the rules that were already in place before the curfew. Andrews refused to say where the idea of the curfew originated, saying there were cabinet records of all decisions. I think that means he's not going to tell us. Anyone who finds fault with this measure can find fault with me. Well, on this I do. On this I do. And the Premier should be truthful. He knows where this came from. He knows who dreamed it up, and I think it was him or someone very close to him. Every decision ultimately is something I'm accountable for as the head of the government. Let me be really clear with you. The curfew position at the moment will not be changing because it's working. It's working. If you don't limit movement, you won't limit the number of cases. Well, I say you can actually limit the congestion, and you might actually get a better result without the curfew, actually having supermarkets and the like open longer, but people obeying social distancing and proper rules that are already in place, that were already in place under the arrangements there. There's no evidence that the curfew itself has actually been the key step over the recent period. No evidence at all, and if there is evidence, the Premier ought to produce it. I say that this is the wrong step that has been taken here by the Premier. I say that this curfew should go. I say that the documents should be provided to the chamber and the Victorian community, even more importantly, because they're entitled to see them. They're entitled to know why their liberties and rights are being restricted. They're entitled to understand the medical and health advice which is behind it. In this case, we know there's no medical and health advice that's provided out of the Department of Health, none from the Chief Health Officer, none from others in there, I can tell you, because I've spoken to a number of them. And I think they are quietly furious that they have been prevailed upon under the Public Health and Wellbeing Act to sign off orders under that Act, directions under that Act that are not scientifically based, So let's be quite clear what's gone on here. The Premier's dreamed up an idea. He's wanted to limit movement. He's wanted to appear a tough guy. He's wanted to appear draconian. He's wanted to appear very rough, sending some sort of toughness message to the community. Well, I say actually a more caring message would have been a better message, a message that was focused on science, a message that was focused on the advice of medical experts and not on advice of himself and people in his office. So we think this is a very modest step. It's a reasonable way forward, and I ask the chamber for support on this important motion.